You're banned from this hospital, effective immediately. They escorted the single father out of the hospital like a criminal. Security said he was interfering, that emotional parents didn't belong in operating corridors. He didn't argue, just gave the head nurse one precise warning. Hours later, the head surgeon heard his name and froze. This is about who gets dismissed and who truly saves lives. Before I show you the exact moment when the operating room doors reopened for the man they banned, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What was happening beneath the surface wasn't hysteria. It wasn't grief spiraling out of control. It was precision wrapped in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed above as security tightened their hold on Elias Ward's arms. He didn't resist. His boots dragged once against the polished tile, then steadied. His eyes stayed locked on the red glow above the operating room doors where his daughter lay open on a steel table. "I'm not interfering," he said quietly. "You're missing the arterial instability. Check the posterior branch before you clamp again." The guard scoffed. The administrator turned away. Elias exhaled slowly, as if he were the only calm man in a burning building. Outside the surgical wing, the air shifted from sterile chill to the warmer current of the public lobby. Conversations faltered as staff watched the scene unfold. A sanitation badge hung from his chest, slightly worn at the edges. The same badge that had allowed him into supply closets and service corridors, but not into the room where his daughter fought for her life. He caught Nurse Anika Moreno's gaze as he was led past. She looked unsettled, not because of his anger, but because of his words. Instability. Posterior branch. Clamp again. Those weren't the phrases of a panicked father. The glass doors slid open, and the city's late afternoon glare spilled across his face. He blinked once, adjusting. Behind him, the hospital rose in white stone and tinted windows, prestige stacked high above the labor floors where he spent his nights, mopping surgical runoff and disinfecting steel trays. He had chosen that job deliberately. Chosen proximity over pride. Months earlier, when Mila's diagnosis became unavoidable, he'd traded consulting offers for a janitor's cart. He'd told himself it was temporary, just until she was stable. Just until he could watch every chart, every shift change, every subtle oversight that busy surgeons sometimes missed. He had already buried one person he loved because someone missed something small. Not again. Inside, 12 floors above the lobby, Dr. Celeste Harrow stood at the head of the operating table. Her gloved hands moved with confident efficiency as monitors flickered in rhythm. Residents lined the walls, silent and observant. The board had chosen today to watch her work, an intricate pediatric vascular repair that would reinforce her reputation as the hospital's surgical crown jewel. "She's stable," a resident murmured. "For now," Harrow replied. Her voice carried authority honed by years of command. She had read every scan twice, cross-checked every variable. Mila Ward's condition was rare, yes, but manageable. The father's outburst had been emotional noise, understandable perhaps, but noise. "Clamp," she instructed. Metal touched flesh, a pause, then the monitor tone shifted, not dramatically, not yet, just a subtle drop in pressure that brushed the edge of acceptable. "Adjust suction," she said evenly. Nurse Moreno's brow tightened behind her mask. Pressure dipped again. In the lobby, Elias hadn't left. He stood across the street beneath a skeletal winter tree, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket. Traffic passed. Sirens wailed somewhere distant. He closed his eyes and replayed the imaging in his mind. The faint irregularity near the posterior branch. The fragile wall tension that wouldn't tolerate a standard clamp. He had tried to tell them gently at first, tried to suggest an alternate approach during pre-op briefings, but sanitation staff weren't invited into surgical debates. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He ignored it. Across the glass fade, a flicker of movement caught his attention. 2 nurses running toward an elevator bank reserved for surgical staff. Running. His jaw tightened. Upstairs, alarms began to chirp in uneven cadence. Harrow's posture stiffened. What's her pressure? Dropping. That's not possible, a resident whispered. Find the source, Harrow snapped. Blood pooled faster than projected. Suction intensified. A tremor of urgency crept into the room's choreography. Marino felt it then, a cold thread of memory. You're missing the arterial instability, she swallowed. Doctor, the father earlier. He mentioned a posterior branch complication. Harrow didn't look up. Every anxious parent reads medical journals. Another alarm blared, sharper now. Clamp repositioned. Pressure fell harder. Silence thickened, dense and suffocating. Outside, Elias opened his eyes just as the ambulance bay doors burst open and a surgical runner sprinted toward the main elevators. He didn't move. Not yet, because he knew that sound. And he knew what came next. The ambulance bay doors hadn't opened for a new patient. They had opened for blood. The sharp, staccato alarm drifting faintly through the sealed glass fade wasn't a general alert. It was a vascular collapse escalating past prediction. Across the street, he straightened. Inside the operating room, suction roared louder. Gauze pads darkened faster than the scrub nurse could replace them. The metallic scent of blood thickened beneath the antiseptic air. Pressure's crashing, a resident said, voice tight. That's not consistent with the repair, Harrow replied, but doubt flickered beneath her calm. Recheck the clamp. It's secure. Another alarm shrieked. Mila's small body lay dwarfed by equipment, draped in blue sterile sheets, her chest rising shallow under mechanical rhythm. The posterior field glistened under surgical light, and then a pulse of crimson where there should have been none. Marino's stomach dropped. In the hallway outside the OR, Administrator Gavin Reese was already speaking into his phone. No, we're handling it internally. We are not calling an outside consultation mid-procedure. Do you understand what that would look like? Behind him, 2 younger nurses exchanged glances. Outside, Elias crossed the street. He didn't rush. He didn't sprint. He moved with deliberate pace, boots striking pavement in even rhythm. Cars honked, irritated at his interruption, but he barely registered the noise. He had warned them. Inside the hospital lobby, the reception desk stiffened as he approached again. You can't come back in, the guard said immediately. I'm not here to argue, he replied quietly. You're about to lose her. The guard's jaw tightened. Sir, posterior branch rupture, he said. It won't respond to standard clamp pressure. It'll shear. Upstairs, a clamp slipped. Blood surged. Damn it, Harrow hissed. Suction. The room shifted from tension to crisis in a single breath. Residents who had been observing now moved with frantic urgency. She's not stabilizing. Of course she's not, Moreno whispered under her mask. Harrow looked up sharply. What did you say? The nurse hesitated only a second. He told us. The father. He was specific. Not emotional, specific. A beat of silence passed between them, punctuated only by the relentless alarm. Get Reese in here, Harrow ordered. In the lobby, Elias stood firm while security debated protocol. Staff members watched openly now. Whispers threaded through the space. That's the father. They banned him. Why's he back? He met their stares without flinching. Upstairs, Gavin entered the OR antechamber, pale beneath fluorescent light. What's happening? Uncontrolled arterial rupture, Harrow said curtly, and apparently your banned sanitation worker predicted it. Gavin blinked. He's not. What's his full name? She interrupted. Elias Ward. The instruments in her hands stilled for half a heartbeat. Ward. She knew that name. Not from hospital staffing logs, not from maintenance rosters, from journals, from a paper she had studied obsessively during residency, Advanced Microvascular Reconstruction Techniques After Traumatic Branch Failure. The procedure had been controversial. Risky. Brilliant. Authored by Dr. Elias Ward. Her pulse quickened. That's impossible, Gavin muttered. Moreno's eyes sharpened. Is it? Harrow's mind raced backward through memory. Conference footage, a keynote speaker with steady hands and unshakable composure explaining arterial shear patterns most surgeons never encountered in their careers. She had admired him. Then he had vanished from the field. The alarm screamed again, her pressures bottoming out. Harrow inhaled slowly, decision crystallizing. "Bring him," she said. Gavin stared at her. "You can't be serious. The optics alone." "I don't care about optics," she snapped. "I care about that child." Silence fell between them, heavy with implication. Downstairs, the guard's radio crackled. He listened. His posture shifted. Elias caught the change immediately. "They want you upstairs," the guard said reluctantly. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded once and moved toward the elevators. Staff parted instinctively, the earlier humiliation hanging in the air like unfinished business. The same polished floors that had carried him out now bore him back in. Inside the elevator, fluorescent light buzzed overhead. His reflection stared back at him in stainless steel walls, a sanitation uniform, worn boots, eyes steady and unreadable. The elevator climbed. Each floor ticked upward with mechanical inevitability. On the surgical level, the doors opened to controlled chaos. Nurses moved quickly. A resident nearly collided with him, then froze in recognition. "You, where is she?" he asked. The resident swallowed. Or 3. He walked past the red warning light above the door, the same one he had stared at from outside hours ago. Through the glass panel, he saw the truth instantly. Clamp placement wrong. Shear confirmed. Time evaporating. Harrow met his gaze across the sterile field. For a moment, hierarchy dissolved. "You were right," she said, voice tight. "We need your help." He scrubbed in without another word. Before he stepped fully into the room, pause here for a second. If you believe skill should matter more than status, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next proves it. The water ran hot over his hands. 8 minutes, he calculated silently. That was all they had left. The scrub sink water shut off with a sharp metallic click, and Elias stepped into the operating room as if he had never left it. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The alarm still shrieked. The suction still roared. But something steadied when he entered, like the room itself recognized him. Mila lay pale beneath surgical lights, her small chest rising under mechanical rhythm. The monitor flashed unstable numbers, red climbing over yellow. Blood pooled where it shouldn't, spreading in defiance of clamps that had already failed twice. He didn't look at Harrow first. He looked at his daughter. Then at the field. The posterior branch tore along the shear line, he said calmly. Clamp pressure aggravated it. One of the residents stiffened. "That's exactly what we." Silence, Harrow snapped, though her voice held no arrogance now, only urgency. Elias stepped into position opposite her. "What's her current pressure?" 70 systolic and falling. He nodded once. "We don't chase it. We control the source." He extended his hand. The scrub nurse hesitated a fraction of a second before placing the instrument into his palm. The steel felt familiar, balanced, honest. Gavin stood near the observation window watching through glass with board members behind him. their tailored suits and pale expressions reflected back in sterile light. This wasn't in the brochure. This wasn't the controlled display of excellence they had promised donors. Inside the room, Elias leaned closer to the operative field. There, he murmured, "See that fray?" Harrow followed his line of sight. The rupture wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like fabric pulled too tight at a seam. "I reinforced that area," she said defensively. With standard sutures, he replied evenly. "It needs a floating graft, or it'll keep tearing." The monitor beeped faster. "She's losing volume," Moreno said. Elias adjusted suction with his free hand. "Prepare microvascular graft set. And get me the thinner filament, the one you probably haven't used since residency." A resident blinked. "That's outdated. It's precise," Elias corrected without looking up. "There's a difference." The air tightened again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was recalibration. Harrow made a decision. "Do what he says." The words carried weight. They shifted the axis of authority in the room. For the first time since the crisis began, the chaos aligned behind a single direction. Gavin's jaw flexed beyond the glass. He wasn't hearing the details, but he was seeing something far more unsettling: his band sanitation worker leading his star surgeon. Elias worked quickly, but not frantically. His movements were economical, controlled. Every adjustment anticipated the next. He didn't waste motion. He didn't waste breath. "You've done this before," Moreno said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "How many times?" "Enough." A tremor rippled across the monitor. "Pressure 65, a resident warned. We're not losing her," Elias said, and there was no doubt in his tone. Not arrogance. Certainty. He positioned the graft with delicate precision, hands steady despite the alarms screaming inches from his ear. Sweat gathered beneath his surgical cap, but his fingers remained unshaken. Harrow watched him closely. She remembered the lecture hall years ago, the way Dr. Ward had described arterial shear like it was a living thing, not an enemy. A behavior pattern, something that could be understood if you listened to it. He was listening now. "Release tension slowly," he instructed. A clamp eased. Blood threatened again. Then slowed. The room collectively held its breath. Pressure stabilizing. 70, 72, the anesthesiologist reported. No one celebrated. Not yet. Elias secured the graft with meticulous sutures, threading filament so fine it seemed invisible under harsh light. "This isn't about force," he said quietly. "It's about respect. The vessel's already traumatized." Harrow felt something unfamiliar settle inside her. Humility. Another monitor tone shifted, this time upward. 80 systolic. The suction volume decreased. The field cleared. Moreno exhaled, barely aware she'd been holding her breath. Outside, Gavin pressed a hand against the glass. The board members were whispering now. Who is he? Why was he banned? Why didn't we know? Inside, Elias continued sealing the reconstruction. "She'll need close monitoring post-op," he said, "and no aggressive repositioning for 48 hours. "You're giving orders now?" one resident muttered before catching Harrow's warning glance. "He's saving her," Harrow replied sharply. Silence followed. The graft held. For the first time since the rupture, the alarm softened from shriek to steady pulse. Pressure climbed. 85, 90. Elias leaned back slightly, not relaxing, but recalculating. "We're not finished," he said. "But she's out of immediate collapse." The room exhaled as one organism. Harrow removed her gloves slowly, eyes never leaving the operative field. "You saw it before any of us," she said. "I saw the imaging," he replied. "You were focused on the visible defect. The shear was hiding behind it, and you tried to tell us, yes." There was no accusation in his voice, only fact. The weight of that fact pressed against every person in the room. Harrow turned toward the observation window. Through the glass, she met Gavin's stare. Then she looked back at Elias. "What else are we missing?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He studied the monitor, listened to the rhythm, and then he spoke. "We're about to find out." The words settled over the operating room like a second layer of sterile drape, thin, controlled, but heavy with warning. The monitors had stabilized, but not convincingly. Mila's blood pressure hovered in the low 90s, fragile as glass. The graft held for now, a delicate bridge between rupture and recovery, but Elias's eyes narrowed at the rhythm on the screen. "Her waveform's irregular," he murmured. The anesthesiologist frowned. "It's within acceptable variance." "It won't be," Elias replied quietly. Harrow stepped closer again, reclaiming her place beside him, but not above him. "What do you see?" He adjusted the angle of the surgical light slightly, studying the tissue around the graft. Microspasms along the adjacent branch. The trauma didn't stop at the tear. A resident shifted uneasily. "We repaired the rupture. You repaired the symptom," Elias said without heat. "Not the reaction." The suction hissed softly now, less frantic. But tension hadn't left the room. It had simply changed shape. Outside the glass, Gavin spoke sharply into his phone again. No press statements. Not yet. "We're stabilizing the situation." Board members whispered behind him, eyes flicking between the sanitation uniform beneath the surgical gown and the hospital's most celebrated surgeon standing beside him as equal. Inside, Marino wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. Pressure's dipping again. 88. Elias didn't flinch. That's the spasm starting. Harrow's jaw tightened. "Treatment?" "Vessel relaxation protocol," he said immediately. "Low-dose infusion. Slow. Too aggressive and the graft destabilizes." A resident hesitated. "That's not standard pediatric protocol, neither is this rupture pattern," Elias replied. Silence. Then Harrow nodded. "Prepare the infusion." As the team moved, she studied him openly now. There was no trace of the agitation she'd witnessed in the corridor earlier, no emotional volatility, only precision, only focus. "You left surgery," she said quietly, almost to herself. "For a reason," he answered. Marino glanced between them, sensing the unspoken history layered beneath the present crisis. The infusion began. For several agonizing seconds, nothing changed. Then the waveform smoothed slightly. "Pressure holding at 89, the anesthesiologist reported. "Hold it there," Elias said. "We don't chase numbers, we stabilize behavior." Harrow's lips pressed thin. Behavior. That was how he described vessels, like living systems that needed understanding rather than force. Another minute passed. The alarm softened further. 92, 95. The graft remained intact. Elias stepped back half an inch, shoulders lowering slightly but not fully relaxing. "She's responding." Moreno let out a shaky breath. "She's responding," she echoed. Behind the glass, Gavin's expression shifted from panic to calculation. This wasn't just a surgical complication anymore. It was a narrative reversal. Staff who had watched security escort Elias out were now watching him anchor the room. One board member leaned toward Gavin. "You banned him?" Gavin didn't answer. Inside, Harrow removed her outer gloves and flexed her fingers. "We continue controlled closure," she said. Slowly. Elias nodded. No tension on the graft. The room moved with new alignment, less frantic, more deliberate. Even the younger residents seemed recalibrated, their earlier skepticism replaced with sharp attentiveness. As closure progressed, the steady rhythm of Mila's heartbeat filled the space, no longer frantic, no longer collapsing. Harrow finally exhaled fully. "She's stable," the anesthesiologist confirmed. The word landed differently this time. Stable. Not temporary. not hopeful. Stable. Elias's gaze lingered on his daughter's small hand resting against the surgical drape. He didn't reach for it. Couldn't. But his voice softened. She's strong. Harrow studied him. You knew she would survive. I knew she could. He corrected. If we stopped fighting the vessel and started listening to it, the statement lingered. Listening. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Gavin stepped away from the glass at last, face pale. The board members were no longer whispering. They were watching him. Inside, Moreno cleared her throat gently. Dr. Post-op monitoring? Harrow didn't hesitate. He'll oversee it. A few heads turned. She met their stares evenly. He predicted the complication. He corrected it. We don't ignore that. Elias looked at her for the first time without urgency clouding the moment. That's not necessary, he said quietly. It is, she replied. There was no pride left in her tone now, only acknowledgement. Closure completed. Instruments were counted. The final suture sealed the incision. The red light above the operating room door switched off. Silence followed, not the suffocating silence of crisis, but the stunned quiet of survival. As staff began post-operative transition procedures, Harrow removed her mask and stepped closer to him. I owe you more than an apology, she said, low enough that only he could hear. He shook his head slightly. You owe her recovery. Her eyes flicked toward Mila. And you? She asked. He held her gaze steadily. I just owe her my presence. Beyond the glass, word was already spreading through the floor. Nurses who had witnessed his removal were now whispering about the reversal. Residents were murmuring about journal articles and vanished careers. The hospital had shifted, not publicly, not officially, but undeniably. Harrow straightened, squaring her shoulders before addressing the room. Prepare for transfer to pediatric ICU. And notify administration that we'll be holding a full review. Gavin stiffened outside. Elias stepped back from the table at last, the weight of adrenaline beginning to drain from his limbs. The crisis had been contained. But the reckoning had only begun. Mila was wheeled out of the operating room, her small body cocooned in sterile blankets and humming machines. The hallway that had once echoed with Elias's forced removal now filled with staff stepping aside in silence. No one told him to stop this time. He walked beside the gurney, not touching, just watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Iku's prepped, Moreno said softly. Her voice carried something new, respect without hesitation. He nodded. Keep her elevated 10 degrees. No sudden turns, we will. Behind them, Dr. Harrow emerged from the oar, mask removed, fatigue lining her features. Gavin intercepted her immediately. This needs to be contained, he whispered urgently. The board's already asking questions. Harrow didn't slow her pace. Containment ended when we escorted the only qualified surgeon out of the building. Gavin's jaw tightened. He's sanitation staff. He's Elias Ward, she replied sharply. And you knew that when you banned him? Gavin didn't answer. The ICU doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh. Monitors resumed their steady rhythm inside the dimly lit room. Nurses transferred Mila carefully, following Elias's earlier instructions without debate. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching, listening, stable. Moreno adjusted an IV line and glanced at him. You predicted the exact shear pattern. How? He hesitated. The fluorescent light reflected faintly in his eyes. I've seen it before. Where? War zones. Emergency reconstruction after blast trauma. His tone remained even, but something distant flickered behind it. Arteries behave the same under pressure, whether it's shrapnel or a clamp. Moreno absorbed that quietly. Across the unit, whispers had begun again. Not cruel this time. Curious. That's him. The janitor? No, apparently not. Elias heard it all. He let it pass. Harrow stepped into the ICU a few minutes later, her posture composed but no longer rigid. She approached him directly. You should have told us who you were. He didn't look away from Mila. Would it have changed anything? Silence. She exhaled slowly. It should have. Titles don't guarantee listening, he replied. That struck deeper than accusation. Gavin entered moments later, flanked by 2 board members. Their suits looked out of place against the soft hum of pediatric equipment. Mr. Ward, Gavin began carefully, we need to discuss. It's Dr. Ward. One of the board members interjected quietly, glancing at Harrow for confirmation. Harrow gave a single nod. The shift in language rippled through the room. Elias finally turned. I didn't come back for recognition, he said calmly. I came back because she was dying. And you saved her, the board member replied. We saved her, Harrow corrected. The administrator cleared his throat. There will be a formal review of today's events. The board would like to offer. Stop, Elias said gently. All eyes settled on him. If you're about to offer me a reinstatement or a public statement, don't. Gavin blinked. You're declining? I'm prioritizing my daughter. A quiet pause followed. Before this continues, if you believe dignity matters more than job titles, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next isn't about applause. It's about accountability. Harrow studied him carefully. You knew this hospital was her best option. That's why you took the sanitation job. He didn't deny it. You monitored our protocols, she continued. You watched. I listened, he corrected softly. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. Gavin shifted his stance. This narrative isn't yours to manage, Harrow said sharply. For the first time, Gavin looked uncertain. Moreno stepped closer to the bed, adjusting Mila's blanket. She'll wake up in a few hours, she said to Elias. We'll monitor every fluctuation. Thank you, he replied. The EQ felt different now. Not just because the crisis had passed, but because power had realigned. Staff who once overlooked him were now watching for instruction, not out of obligation, out of trust. Harrow folded her arms lightly. There will be questions. From the board. From donors. From staff. There should be, Elias said. About why we didn't listen sooner, he held her gaze steadily. That part's yours to answer. The words weren't cruel, they were clean. Gavin inhaled slowly. We can issue a joint statement. Not tonight, Harrow said. Tonight we focus on recovery. Mila stirred faintly beneath sedation, fingers twitching. Elias stepped closer, voice lowering instinctively. I'm here, he murmured. Her monitor beeped steadily in reply. The board members gradually retreated, murmuring among themselves. Gavin lingered a second longer, then followed, expression tight. Harrow remained. You walked back in without hesitation, she said quietly. You called, he replied. And if we hadn't? His eyes shifted to Mila. Then I would have kept knocking. Silence settled between them, not hostile, not defensive, just honest. The alarms were gone now. Only the gentle hum of machines remained. For the first time all day, Elias allowed himself to sit, not as sanitation staff, not as a disgraced father, just as a parent beside his child. Outside the ICU doors, the hospital buzzed with restrained shock. Stories were forming, narratives reshaping. Inside, Harrow looked at him once more. This isn't over, she said. He nodded. I know. The ICU lights dimmed slightly as evening settled beyond the hospital windows. Mila's breathing remained steady, each rise of her chest syncing with the soft mechanical pulse beside her bed. Elias hadn't moved from the chair. Across the room, Dr. Harrow stood with arms folded, watching the monitors with the same intensity she had shown in surgery, but now there was something reflective in her gaze. She's holding, Moreno said quietly, checking the infusion line. No signs of graft rejection. She won't reject it, Elias replied. The tensions balanced. Harrow glanced at him. You speak about vessels like they're people. They respond better when you treat them that way. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched Moreno's face. Outside the ICU glass wall, staff continued to drift past more slowly than usual. Word had spread through surgical floors, through maintenance corridors, through administrative offices. Dr. Elias Ward. The name no longer whispered with confusion, but recognition. Downstairs, Gavin stood in a small conference room with 3 board members seated around a polished oak table. His jacket lay folded over a chair, his tie loosened. You banned him without verifying credentials? One board member asked sharply. He was disruptive, Gavin insisted. He was interfering in restricted areas. He predicted the rupture, another member countered. Our head of surgery just confirmed it. Gavin's silence felt heavier than defense. Back in the IQ, Harrow pulled a chair closer to Elias. I reviewed your old publications after surgery, she said. You disappeared 10 years ago. My wife died, he replied simply. The room grew quieter somehow, even with machines humming. Complication? Moreno asked gently. Missed instability, he said. A subtle one. No one listened to my concern. Not loudly enough. Harrow absorbed that. You left because of that. I left because I couldn't stand in another operating room without hearing the monitor flatline. There was no self-pity in his tone. Just fact. Moreno looked down at Mila. And now you stood in one again. For her, he answered. Silence settled. Heavy, but not suffocating. Harrow leaned back slightly. You took a sanitation position here on purpose, yes. To stay close, yes. And you never intended to reveal who you were, he met her gaze. Not unless I had to. The honesty of that answer seemed to recalibrate something inside her. Outside the ICU, 2 residents paused near the nurse's station. I saw the graft technique, one whispered. It was textbook ward reconstruction. That was him? The other breathed. Yeah, the myth had returned to flesh. Inside, Mila stirred again, eyelids fluttering faintly. Elias immediately leaned forward. Easy, he murmured. Her fingers twitched against the blanket. A soft, almost inaudible sound escaped her throat. She's coming around, Moreno said, checking vitals. The monitor remained steady. Harrow stood. I'll inform the board she's stable through the night. Elias looked at her. They're worried about liability. They're worried about perception, she corrected. There's a difference. And you? She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. I'm worried about what we missed before you said anything. That admission carried weight. He nodded once. Listening isn't weakness, no, she agreed quietly. It's discipline. Outside, the hospital's evening rhythm resumed. Stretchers rolled, phones rang, elevators chimed. But something fundamental had shifted in its bloodstream. Gavin returned to the ICU floor shortly after, posture composed, but eyes guarded. He stopped outside the glass before stepping in. Dr. Ward, he began carefully. Elias didn't stand. Administrator. Gavin inhaled slowly. The board would like to extend a formal apology for your removal earlier today. Harrow's gaze flicked to him sharply, assessing his tone. Elias considered the words. Accepted, he said calmly. Gavin seemed almost surprised by the lack of resistance. Additionally, they're requesting a closed review of surgical protocol led by you. Moreno glanced between them. Elias shook his head slightly, led by Dr. Harrow. Harrow stiffened. You're deflecting. I'm prioritizing, he replied. She made the call to bring me back. That matters. A quiet shift moved through the room again. Gavin studied him carefully. You're not interested in reclaiming your former title? My title isn't what saved her. Silence followed. Harrow stepped closer to Gavin. We'll conduct the review together. Gavin nodded slowly. Very well, he turned to leave but paused at the door. The board underestimated you, he said. Elias looked back at Mila. Many people do. When Gavin left, Moreno let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You could have demanded more, she said. I demanded what mattered. Mila's eyes fluttered open slightly then, unfocused but aware. Dad, she whispered. Every sound in the room faded. I'm here, he said softly. Her gaze settled on him, fragile but alive. Harrow watched the exchange quietly, something resolute forming in her posture. The crisis had been surgical. But the lesson wasn't, and tomorrow the hospital will have to face it. Morning light filtered through the narrow EQ window, pale and honest. Mila slept again, her vitals steady through the night. The monitors hummed without urgency now, their rhythm almost gentle. Elias hadn't left. A disposable cup of untouched coffee sat on the side table. His posture remained upright despite the exhaustion lining his face. Every time the machine shifted tone, even slightly, his eyes lifted. Moreno entered quietly at shift change, reviewing charts. No complications overnight, she said. Grafts holding beautifully. He nodded. She'll feel sore when she wakes fully. We'll manage it. Across the hall, staff movement carried a different energy than usual. Conversations paused when he passed. Some nodded. Some looked away, unsure how to recalibrate their earlier dismissal. The sanitation cart he normally pushed down these corridors stood parked in a supply alcove, untouched. Harrow arrived shortly after sunrise. She looked composed again, hair neatly secured, white coat crisp, but the weight behind her eyes hadn't disappeared. She's stable, Moreno confirmed for her. Harrow approached the bed and studied the monitors herself before turning to him. The board convenes in an hour. He didn't ask what that meant. They want a full accounting of yesterday, she continued, including the decision to remove you. That was administration, he said evenly. It happened under my surgical authority. He considered that. You brought me back. I should have listened sooner. The admission hung between them without defensiveness. From down the hall came the low murmur of staff gathering in conference rooms. Word of the board meeting had spread quickly. The hospital wasn't accustomed to public vulnerability. Mila stirred again, blinking more fully this time. Her gaze focused quicker. Dad, I'm right here. She tried to lift her hand. He gently steadied it. Easy. Did it work? She whispered. He smiled faintly. Yeah, it worked. Her eyes drifted toward Harrow. You're the doctor. I am, Harrow replied softly. She helped too, he added. Mila gave a faint nod before drifting back to sleep. The quiet that followed felt earned. Harrow stepped aside, lowering her voice. You're coming to the board review. That's not necessary. It is, she insisted. They need to see the full picture. He studied her carefully. You're prepared to challenge them? I'm prepared to correct them. There was steel beneath her calm. Outside the ICU doors, Gavin stood speaking to two senior surgeons. His posture was controlled, but his eyes betrayed calculation. When Harrow stepped out to join him, Elias remained seated. We'll begin shortly, Gavin said. Good, she replied. Transparency's overdue. He lowered his voice. We don't need spectacle. We need accountability. Gavin's jaw tightened. Inside the ICU, Moreno leaned against the counter, watching Elias. You don't seem angry, she observed. He looked at his daughter. Anger wastes precision. You were humiliated yesterday, he considered that. I was focused. And now? He exhaled slowly. Now I'm listening. Footsteps approached again. A resident hovered near the doorway, hesitant. Dr. Ward, he said awkwardly. I just wanted to say, I've read your reconstruction paper 3 times. Elias met his gaze. Then you know it's not about technique. It's about understanding stress behavior, the resident replied quickly. A faint approval flickered in Elias's expression. Good, the resident nodded, almost relieved, and stepped back. Moments later, Harrow returned. They're ready. He stood finely, fatigue evident in the slow stretch of his shoulders. Moreno glanced at him. We'll stay with her. He nodded once. The walk down the corridor felt different than the day before. No guards blocked his path, no one reached for his arm. Staff stepped aside naturally, some offering quiet nods. The conference room doors opened. Inside, the board sat around the long table. Gavin stood near the head. The same polished oak that had hosted celebratory donor dinners now awaited uncomfortable truth. Harrow entered first. Elias followed. Murmurs stilled. Gavin cleared his throat. We're here to review yesterday's surgical emergency and subsequent actions. Harrow didn't sit. Begin with the ban. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Gavin inhaled. Security removed Dr. Ward due to interference in a restricted area. Interference that predicted the complication, Harrow corrected calmly. Silence thickened. One board member leaned forward. Why was his expertise unknown to administration? Elias answered evenly. Because I didn't advertise it, that doesn't absolve us of due diligence, the board member said, glancing at Gavin. Harrow folded her hands on the table. The greater failure wasn't administrative, it was cognitive. Eyes lifted. We dismissed a voice because of appearance, she continued, not content. No one interrupted her. Elias remained standing, not claiming the head of the table, not positioning himself as victor. Gavin finally spoke. We'll implement protocol revisions ensuring all credentialed staff. Credentialed isn't the issue, Harrow said quietly. Listening is. The word echoed. Listening. Outside the conference room, hospital activity resumed, but something intangible had shifted in its rhythm. Inside, the board faced the uncomfortable truth that authority had nearly cost a child her life, and Elias stood in the center of it, not as a conqueror, but as proof. The conference room remained still after Harrow's final words settled into the polished wood and glass. Listening. It wasn't a policy, it wasn't a credential, it was a discipline, and yesterday they had failed it. One board member cleared his throat. Dr. Ward, if you had been granted immediate access, would the complication have been avoided entirely? Elias didn't rush his answer. Not avoided, he said evenly. Managed sooner. And the rupture? Likely minimized, a quiet murmur passed around the table. Gavin leaned forward, fingers interlaced. We're not disputing your expertise. The concern is structural. We can't have unscheduled personnel entering surgical zones. You can, Elias replied calmly, if you build a system where concerns are evaluated on merit instead of hierarchy. The statement landed harder than the accusation. Harrow nodded once. We revise preoperative consultation protocols. Any parent raising specific procedural concerns receives review, not removal. Gavin hesitated. That opens liability, it opens dialogue, she cut in. Silence followed. Elias studied the faces around the table. Executives. Donors. Surgeons. People accustomed to control. You're asking how to prepare for the next crisis, he said. Start by assuming expertise doesn't always announce itself. A board member leaned back slowly. And if that expertise isn't on payroll, then you evaluate it anyway. The simplicity unsettled them more than complexity would have. Before we continue, take a second. If you believe humility belongs in leadership, subscribe with the bell on. Because what happens after this meeting changes more than one policy. Gavin exhaled slowly. We'll form a surgical advisory panel. Harrow's gaze sharpened. Led jointly. With you, Gavin added quickly. She looked at Elias. He shook his head slightly. I won't take a permanent role. A few eyebrows lifted. You'd decline? A board member asked. I'm not interested in reclaiming status, he replied. I'm interested in preventing repetition. The room grew quiet again. Then serve as consultant, Harrow said. Temporary. Focused on protocol revision, he considered that. Not prestige, not title, prevention. I'll review vascular response protocols, he said at last, and train on shear recognition patterns. Gavin nodded. Agreed. The decision felt less like concession and more like correction. Outside the room, staff gathered discreetly, sensing the outcome before it was announced. Word traveled fast in hospitals, especially when power shifted. When the doors opened, conversations paused. Harrow stepped out first, posture composed. Elias followed beside her, not behind. No guards, no hesitation. Moreno approached them immediately. How'd it go? Listening, Harrow replied simply. Moreno's eyes flicked to him. You staying? For a bit, he answered. Relief softened her expression. Down the corridor, 2 residents straightened as he passed. One spoke quietly. We're reviewing the graft footage. It was extraordinary. Elias didn't slow. It was necessary. The humility in his tone traveled further than arrogance ever could. They reached the EQ again. Mila was awake now, pale but alert, sipping water through a straw. You left, she said softly when she saw him. I had to talk to some people. Did you win? He smiled faintly. That's not what it was. She frowned slightly. Then what? Fixing something, Harrow lingered near the doorway, watching the exchange. Can I go home soon? Mila asked. Soon, he said gently. But we take it slow, she nodded seriously, as if accepting terms of a contract. Moreno adjusted her blanket again. Vitals still steady, Harrow stepped closer to the bed. You gave us quite a scare. Mila glanced at her father. He gets scary when he's quiet. A few soft laughs eased the room. Elias met Harrow's gaze across the bed. You'll have resistance, he said quietly. I know, change feels like criticism. It is criticism, she replied. Of habit, he nodded once. Outside the ICU, Gavin stood speaking to department heads. His tone was measured now, not defensive. Word of the advisory panel was already spreading. Inside, Mila leaned back against her pillow. Dad? Yes? You're not cleaning floors anymore, are you? He hesitated. For now, he said carefully, I'm just staying close. Her small hand slipped into his. Harrow watched that gesture and understood something she hadn't before. Prestige wasn't what had brought him back into surgery. Love had. She stepped toward the door, pausing briefly. We begin protocol review tomorrow morning, she said. 9 a.m. He nodded. As she left, the EQ felt lighter, not because the crisis was forgotten, but because it had been faced honestly. The alarms were silent now. Only steady heartbeats remained. Morning settled fully over the hospital by the time Elias stepped out of the IQ and into the conference wing again. The advisory session had been scheduled quickly, too quickly for comfort. Department heads lined one side of the long table. Surgical residents filled the back row. Gavin sat near the head, expression composed but cautious. Dr. Harrow stood beside a projection screen displaying still images from Mila's surgery. We begin with pattern recognition, she said. Specifically, posterior branch shear. She nodded toward Elias. He didn't move immediately. The room waited. Then he stepped forward. The sanitation badge was gone now. In its place, a temporary consultant ID clipped to his coat. It looked almost ironic against the years of experience it failed to represent. He pointed to the magnified image on the screen. Most of you saw rupture, he began. What you missed was pre-rupture stress. A resident shifted in his seat. The imaging didn't show that clearly. It did, Elias replied evenly. You weren't looking for it. The words weren't sharp, but they weren't soft either. Harrow folded her arms, observing the room's reaction. Some bristled. Some leaned forward. He clicked to the next slide, arterial mapping overlays he had requested from records overnight. This subtle narrowing here, he said, that's not incidental. It's cumulative tension. One of the senior surgeons frowned. That level of prediction isn't standard in pediatric repair. Standard is built on repetition, Elias answered. Rare cases require deviation. Gavin watched the exchange carefully. So you're proposing deviation from established protocol? The senior surgeon pressed. I'm proposing responsiveness, Elias said calmly. Protocol should guide you, not blind you. A murmur rippled through the room. Harrow stepped in smoothly. We're not dismantling standards. We're refining them. She met Gavin's gaze briefly. The presentation continued, video slowed frame by frame. Elias narrated the exact moment clamp pressure intensified the shear. Right there, he said, that's where we lost control. The resident who had assisted that step lowered his eyes slightly. Elias noticed. This isn't about blame, he said. It's about anticipation. Silence followed. He shifted to a final slide, 3 bullet points. Pre-op listening. Intra-op flexibility. Post-op monitoring precision. That's it? Someone asked. That's everything, he replied. The simplicity unsettled them again. Gavin cleared his throat. Implementation timeline? Immediate, Harrow said before Elias could answer. Training begins this week. A pause. The senior surgeon leaned back. You're asking us to trust subjective assessment. I'm asking you to sharpen it, Elias replied. Moreno stood quietly near the back, having slipped in during the presentation. Her presence anchored the human side of the discussion. A young resident finally raised her hand. What would you have done differently pre-op? Elias met her gaze. I would have listened to the concern raised before surgery. The room stilled, not accusatory, factual. Harrow didn't look away. Gavin exhaled slowly. Then we codify that. Mandatory parent consultation documentation. A board member near the wall nodded. Agreed. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was real. After the session ended, clusters of staff lingered. Some approached Elias cautiously. I didn't realize who you were, one surgeon admitted. I didn't need you to, he said. Another resident extended a hand. Thank you for walking us through it. He shook it briefly. Just learn from it. Harrow gathered her files, watching the room's energy recalibrate. You handled that gently, she said when they were alone. Gentle lasts longer, he replied. She studied him. You could have humiliated us. He looked at her evenly. That wouldn't have saved the next child. The words lingered between them. A nurse approached hurriedly. Mila's asking for you. He didn't hesitate. They walked back toward the EQ together. This time, staff didn't whisper. They nodded. Inside the room, Mila was sitting up slightly, color returning to her cheeks. You missed it, she said. Missed what? He asked, stepping closer. They let me have real juice. He smiled faintly. That's serious progress. She looked between him and Harrow. Are you friends now? Harrow's lips curved subtly. We're colleagues. Mila seemed satisfied with that answer. As Elias adjusted her pillow, Harrow lingered near the doorway. You changed the culture in a day, she said quietly. He shook his head. No, the crisis did, she considered that. Still, she added, you could have walked away. He glanced at his daughter. I almost did. The admission surprised even him, but you didn't, she said. No. Outside, the hospital hummed differently now. Not quieter, not louder, just more aware. Inside the ICU, Mila leaned back comfortably. Dad? Yes? You're staying, right? He met her gaze. For as long as you need, and for the first time since the ban, since the alarms, since the rupture, The hospital felt steady. Not perfect, not redeemed, but steadier. Mila was discharged from ICU to a step-down pediatric room 2 days later, her recovery progressing without complication. The graft held firm. Her color returned. Laughter began replacing alarms. Elias remained close, splitting time between her bedside and early morning protocol sessions with surgical staff. The advisory panel had moved from theory to implementation faster than anyone expected. Change, when born from crisis, had momentum. In the pediatric wing, nurses now paused longer when parents raised concerns. Preoperative meetings had expanded by 15 minutes, not enough to slow efficiency, but enough to invite voice. Harrow stood outside Mila's new room one afternoon, reviewing updated documentation forms on a tablet. She glanced through the glass and saw him adjusting a blanket again, instinctively checking IV lines as if they were extensions of his own pulse. "You've been here every day," she said when he stepped into the hallway. "So have you," he replied. A faint smile flickered across her face. "That's different." "Is it?" She studied him. "I used to think control meant certainty." "And now I think it means adaptability," he nodded once. Certainty closes ears, footsteps approached. Gavin walked toward them, posture measured but no longer defensive. "The board approved full implementation," he said. "Mandatory consultation acknowledgement before high-risk pediatric surgery." Harrow inclined her head slightly. "Good," Gavin hesitated. "They also requested a public statement." Elias's expression remained neutral. "About what?" "About what happened, and about what we're changing." Silence stretched for a moment. Harrow looked at him. "It's your call," he exhaled slowly. "No hero narratives," Gavin blinked. "Understood. No mention of bans. No spectacle," Elias continued. "Just focus on the policy shift." Gavin nodded. "That may raise questions. Then answer them honestly," Harrow said evenly. He looked between them and for the first time since the crisis gave a short nod without resistance. "Very well." When he left, the hallway felt lighter. Inside the room, Mila was awake, flipping through a children's book a volunteer had brought. "Dad, they said I might go home tomorrow," she said, eyes bright. "If your lab stays stable," he replied. "They will." Her confidence felt inherited. Harrow stepped into the doorway. "She's right. Everything looks strong." Mila grinned. "See?" He chuckled softly. "You've always been stubborn, like you," she shot back. Harrow watched them quietly, something reflective settling in her expression. "You could come back full-time," she said suddenly, addressing him. Mila looked up immediately. "Come back where?" "To surgery," Harrow clarified. Elias paused. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Down the hall, a monitor beeped faintly from another room. He considered the offer not from ego, but from memory. The smell of antiseptic, the weight of responsibility, the echo of a flatline years ago. "I'm not sure that's where I belong anymore," he said honestly. Harrow didn't argue. "You belong where you're needed," she replied. He glanced at Mila. "That's here," he said quietly. Mila squeezed his hand. Harrow nodded slowly. "Then consult. Teach, visit when you choose." "That I can do?" Outside the room, 2 nurses passed, discussing updated intake forms. "Did you see the new section?" one asked. "Parent input required before final surgical approval." "About time," the other replied. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Later that evening, as the sun dipped beyond the city skyline, Elias stepped into the rooftop garden for the first time since the crisis. The air carried the faint scent of rain. Harrow joined him a moment later. "You were right about something else," she said. "What's that?" This wasn't about being right. He watched the city lights flicker on one by one. "No," he agreed. "It was about being heard." She folded her arms lightly. "You changed more than a protocol." He shook his head slightly. The system was ready to change. It just needed pressure. She studied him carefully. "You don't resent us." I resented the silence, he corrected. Not the people. A quiet understanding passed between them. Below, the hospital continued its rhythm, patients arriving, surgeons moving, families waiting. But now, somewhere in every pre-op conversation, a pause existed where it hadn't before. Listening. Harrow glanced toward the ICU wing visible from the rooftop edge. "She'll be discharged tomorrow," she said. He nodded. And after that, he looked out across the city, lights stretching into the distance. "After that," he said slowly, "we go home." And this time, the word felt earned. Morning arrived with quiet efficiency. Discharge papers rested neatly at the foot of Mila's bed, clipped and signed. The machines that had once dictated every breath were gone, replaced by simple monitoring patches and careful instructions. Mila swung her legs gently over the side of the bed. "I don't like hospital socks," she declared. Elias crouched to help her with her shoes. "You survived surgery. I think you can survive wearing socks." She wrinkled her nose. "Barely." Harrow stepped into the room carrying a thin folder. "Final clearance," she said. "Vitals are strong. Labs are clean." Mila grinned. "So I'm free?" "For now," Harrow replied with a soft smile. Elias stood slowly. The exhaustion of the past days lingered in his posture, but it no longer carried urgency. Gavin appeared at the doorway a moment later, flanked by 2 board members. There was no tension in his stride this time, only measured purpose. "We won't keep you long," Gavin said. "But we wanted to say this in person." Mila looked between the adults curiously. The board member stepped forward. "Dr. Ward, the hospital formally acknowledges that your removal from the surgical floor was an error in judgment." Silence filled the room. Gavin continued, voice steady. "We failed to evaluate the merit of your concern. For that we apologize." Elias met his gaze calmly. Accepted. The simplicity of his response seemed to disarm them again. Harrow watched closely. "We've also approved the advisory revisions you proposed," Gavin added. "They go into effect immediately." "That's good," Elias said quietly. Mila tugged his sleeve. "What are they talking about?" He glanced down at her, "Just making sure other kids get listened to." She nodded seriously, as if filing that away. The board members exchanged glances before one spoke again. "We would like to recognize your contribution publicly, a statement highlighting your expertise and—" "No," Elias interrupted gently. The word wasn't harsh, just firm. "This wasn't about recognition," he said. "If you make it about me, you miss the point." Harrow's eyes flicked toward him with something like respect sharpened into certainty. Gavin exhaled slowly. "Then what would you suggest?" "Announce the protocol change," Elias replied. "Encourage parents to speak, encourage surgeons to pause." The board member nodded slowly. "And your role?" "Consultant," he said simply. "When needed." Mila looked up at him again. "You're not going to wear the cleaning badge anymore, right?" A quiet laugh moved through the room. "For now," he answered carefully, "I'm just going to be your dad." That seemed to satisfy her. Moreno entered with a small discharge bag. "Transportation's ready downstairs." Elias took the paperwork, reviewing it quickly out of habit. Harrow stepped closer. "You'll come back for follow-ups?" "Of course. And for the review sessions?" He hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Gavin extended his hand. For a second, the memory of security tightening around his arms flickered between them. Then Elias shook it. No triumph, no resentment, just closure. As they moved into the hallway, staff who had gathered discreetly along the corridor straightened. Some offered quiet nods, some whispered congratulations to Mila. No one mentioned the ban. They didn't have to. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. This time, no guard stood beside him. No barrier blocked his path. Inside the elevator, Mila leaned lightly against his side. "Are they nicer now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "They're learning." The elevator descended smoothly. When the doors opened to the lobby, the sunlight pouring through the glass entrance felt warmer than it had days ago. Conversations continued, but no one stared. Gavin remained upstairs, watching from the balcony above. Harrow stood beside him. "You were right," she said quietly. "About what?" he asked. "That it wasn't spectacle we needed." He nodded slowly. Below them, Elias guided Mila toward the exit. Harrow folded her arms lightly. "We almost lost more than a patient." Gavin didn't argue. The sliding doors opened, and father and daughter stepped into daylight together. Outside, the winter air carried a crisp edge, but it felt clean. Mila squeezed his hand. "Home?" "Home," he confirmed. Behind them, the hospital resumed its rhythm, but altered. Pre-op meetings that afternoon lasted longer. Residents asked more questions. Parents spoke without being rushed. And somewhere in the surgical wing, a new pause existed before every clamp tightened. Listening. As the car door closed and the engine started, Elias glanced once in the rearview mirror at the building that had banned him, and then brought him back. He didn't see it as enemy or victory. He saw it as unfinished. And for the first time in years, that didn't feel like burden. It felt like purpose. The car rolled through quiet streets, the hospital shrinking in the rearview mirror until it blended into the skyline. Mila leaned her head against the window, watching buildings blur past. "Can we stop for pancakes?" she asked. He glanced at her, amused. "You just survived vascular reconstruction, so pancakes are reasonable." A soft laugh escaped him. "We'll see what your discharge instructions say about syrup." She grinned, color fully back in her cheeks. Home wasn't far. A modest brick townhouse with a narrow porch and a wind chime that sang whenever the breeze shifted. It wasn't grand. It wasn't prestigious. But it was theirs. When he unlocked the door, Mila stepped inside slowly, as if re-entering something sacred. "It smells the same," she said. "That's because it is." He helped her onto the couch, adjusting pillows carefully. Even here, his movements carried quiet precision, protective, observant. Later that afternoon, after she fell asleep under a soft blanket, his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. A message from Harrow. "Protocol draft approved. First training session tomorrow, thank you." He stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "We listen better next time." A pause. Then her response came. "We will." He set the phone down and leaned against the counter, eyes drifting toward the living room where Mila slept peacefully. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. He had once believed his life in surgery was over, not because he lacked skill, but because he lacked something steadier than expertise, peace. The hospital hadn't given him that. His daughter had. The following week he returned, not as sanitation staff, not as a reinstated department head, but as a consultant seated at a modest conference table. Residents filled the room again, notebooks open. This time, no one questioned why he was there. He walked them through case simulations slowly, deliberately. "What do you do first?" he asked a young surgeon. "Assess the visible rupture," she replied. He nodded. "And what else?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Listen." He returned the smile. Across the hall, Harrow observed through a glass panel. She no longer saw a threat to authority. She saw reinforcement of it, reshaped, not diminished. The hospital's culture didn't transform overnight. Mistakes still happened, pressure still built. But something essential had shifted beneath the surface. Parents were invited to speak. Surgeons paused before dismissing concerns. Administrators verified before reacting. And in pediatric IQ, a framed line had quietly appeared on the wall near the nursing station. "Listening saves lives." One evening, weeks later, Mila sat at the kitchen table doing homework. "Dad? Yes? Are you a janitor or a surgeon?" He considered that carefully before answering. "I'm your dad," he said. She studied him, then nodded as if that solved everything. It did. The hospital still called when rare cases emerged. Sometimes he went, sometimes he didn't. Prestige no longer dictated his presence. Purpose did. On the rooftop garden where he once stood after crisis, Harrow now paused before major procedures, reviewing more than charts, reviewing voices. Gavin adjusted policy documents with less emphasis on optics and more on input. Marino trained new nurses to flag patterns others might overlook. And somewhere in the surgical wing, before clamps tightened and incisions deepened, someone always asked one extra question. Is there anything we're not hearing? That question carried his legacy far louder than any press release ever could. Mila finished her homework and walked into the kitchen. "Pancakes tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. He smiled. Tomorrow. The world hadn't changed entirely. Hospitals were still busy. Authority still existed. Pride still flared. But in one building of glass and steel, humility had carved a permanent space. And sometimes, that was enough. Now tell me, what should our next story title be? Subscribe and don't miss our next story, Security, Remove Him. The single dad whispered 3 words that froze the entire boardroom. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?